right, Daniel chapter 11. We started Daniel 11 last week, and hopefully saw that this is an amazingly detailed prophecy that starts in chapter 10. The setup to the prophecy starts in chapter 10, chapter 11, and goes into the early parts of chapter 12. And this is an amazingly detailed prophecy, little details in history that I've been trying to go back and dig out of the textbooks and the commentaries, and we've seen that it tracks right along with history quite well. We left off last week in chapter 11. Let's pick up in verse 30. Verses 30 through 32 talk about the campaign of Antiochus Epiphanes. You remember him, right? A really evil guy that came against Jerusalem and did all kinds of wicked things. And because of what he had done, we talked about last week, we had the Maccabean revolt. Very interesting reading there in history. And then in verse 30, it talks about how he was turned around when he tried to take Egypt, was sent packing by the Romans. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. It talks about how he, in history we can see how he forbade circumcision, how he stopped the daily sacrifice in the temple, how he desecrated the temple. Verse 31, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary, fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. So he talks then about the people of God, the actions of the faithful in verses 32 through 35, and how they will withstand him even at the cost of their own life, which is very, very inspiring, an example to be followed. But as I mentioned last week, when you get to verse 36, most commentators, they follow along through verse 35, and seems to be pretty much a consensus about what we're talking about. And then you get to verse 36, and it all just blows up. What are we talking about in verse 36 and following? That's what we're going to see if we can discern this evening. Let me just read 36. And then we'll talk about who do we think we're talking about here. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. The king of verse 36. If you were just to read through this and connect to the verses that came previously, who would you think we were talking about? Antiochus, right? Because he was the topic of the previous verses. So we must be talking about Antiochus, right? Well, maybe not. Actually, I would say no, we're not talking about Antiochus Epiphanes anymore. There's a shift that happens in verse 36. Well, why do I say that? I'm going to do like I did last week and put most of the verses up on the screen and highlight some of the key points that we want to discuss tonight. So who is this king? Is it Antiochus Epiphanes? That's the natural way to read this. No, it's not. Why is it not Antiochus? Well, look at verse 40. At the end time, the king of the south, who is that, according to what we've been saying? Who's the king of the south? in general. Remember, you had the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in the south, right? The king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and horsemen and many ships, etc. Is this Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of the north? Well, you look at history, king of the south, the Ptolemies, they never moved against Antiochus. It was always the other way around. So it's like, that doesn't really fit. Maybe we're having doubts about this being Antiochus Epiphanes. Look at verse 42 and 43. We have here war, a successful war even, against Egypt. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. Antiochus Epiphanes never fought against Egypt, not after 168 BC. I mention that year because that's the year that he took over Jerusalem. And so you have, after he took over Jerusalem, then we're fighting against the Egyptians, and he never did that, according to history. So another reason why it's not him. And he never conquered Libya or Ethiopia, that you see in verse 43. By the way, I owe a lot of the material tonight to Jim McGuigan's commentary on Daniel, but as much as I like Jim McGuigan's writings, I don't want to just take his word for it. So I've been trying to back this up and research it and say, what does history tell us? And it seems to play out that Antiochus never did go against Egypt. He never did go against Libya or Ethiopia. So this is not Antiochus Epiphanes. So who else might it be? Any guesses? Any thoughts? So Antiochus came against Jerusalem in 168 BC, thereabouts, 167. So we're 160-something years before Christ. But, that's a great question, Tammy, because in verse 36, is there a gap in time? Are we moving forward in time a good amount? That's the question. Who else might this be? Yeah, he's certainly behind it, right? So it's not unusual that you think about Satan, but this is a king. It's a human king or kingdom. Okay. A good guess. Yeah, but he's been covered earlier in chapter 11. But yeah, he shows up a lot in Daniel, so it's a great guess. Well, a lot of people today, this is the predominant teaching you may hear if you were to go on the internet. This is a modern day Antichrist figure. So we're talking modern day from our perspective, like 21st century or beyond. And this is the Antichrist, who is sort of a type of Antiochus Epiphanes, sort of like this Antichrist is sort of in a way living out the things that Antiochus did. Well, does that make sense? I think it seems unlikely, and I don't want to be dogmatic about this. It's admittedly difficult, but I don't think this makes the best sense. Why do I say that? One thing is you would have a huge jump in time. So we're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, 168 years or so before Christ, and now we jump 2,000, or however long it would be, we jump into modern day times. That's a huge gap that is just skipped over. Well, I mean, that could be, right? I mean, maybe that's how it is. Maybe there's a huge jump that the scriptures make. But then is there no mention of Rome at all? If we jump from the Greeks or the Seleucids to modern day times and beyond, we have nothing to say about the Romans. And didn't the Romans have a huge part to play in Jewish history? But we would just skip over all of them? That seems unusual, surprising. And it deviates from the scope of the book, because as we've seen, these prophecies that we've looked at in the book, they start with Babylon, they end with Rome. Going back to chapter 2, the four sections of the statue, Babylon down to Rome. We had other visions where we went down through Rome. And so now we're just going to leave all that out. Does that seem surprising to you, or something you wouldn't expect, perhaps? Also, we looked at chapter 12 and verse 7. Remember, we bounded the problem last week. When does this prophecy start? When does it end? When do you start the clock? When do you stop the clock? Look at chapter 12, verse 7. I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river, and he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and a half time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be accomplished, completed. As soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people. I think this is a clear reference to what happened in 70 AD, when the Romans shattered the power of the Jewish people and put an end to the temple, put an end to sacrifice, put an end to the priesthood, all of that. And so, if that's the case, then we cannot say that this is a modern day Antichrist figure. Does that make sense? Questions, comments so far? Well, then who could this be? Who is this king? Is it Rome? That kind of fits with the tenor of the book, right? We've seen the prophecies about Rome as we've gone through. I believe it fits very well. And I had to, last week when we didn't get to this, but last week my head was spinning so badly. I thought, I don't know if this is Rome either. But I had to go through and look at the historical details, and you start looking at it, diving into all of that. It really fits nicely, as we'll see. And it fits with the scope of the book. Let's talk about as we go along if Rome is a good fit. But a couple questions first. Isn't it kind of odd that there's such an abrupt change? You look back at chapter 11, 35 and 36. In 36, he just starts, then the king will do as he pleases. Well, wait a minute, why? Are we really going to jump that abruptly to a new kingdom from the Seleucids to the Romans? We skipped over, I forget what the number is, a couple hundred years of Seleucid history. Ben. Yeah. So that can be kind of confusing, right? When he talks about the time of the end, people jump in their mind to, well, that's the end of time. That's the end of the world, when the end times. But it doesn't always mean that, right? This is talking about the time of the end of this prophecy, of what we're dealing with in this prophecy. And so we know that Jerusalem, the temple, everything was destroyed by the Romans. This, like Ben said, this seems to fit pretty well. It is fairly abrupt, but that shouldn't bother us if you look back at chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. We've already seen an abrupt switch, right? Because in verse 2 of chapter 11, he's talking about the Persian kings to come. We covered that last week. And then in verse 3, and a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Who are we talking about? That's Alexander the Great. It just switched. Just sort of mid-breath. It just switches to a different king, different kingdom. So perhaps it's not so strange that we see the same kind of thing starting in verse 36. I was also thinking through this. Our verse 36 here on the slide, talks about the king will do as he pleases. It's like a person, right? The king. And yet I'm equating it to the Roman Empire, which is a bunch of kings, right? You see the possible dilemma here? That shouldn't really, I don't think that should throw us off either when we think about it. Look back at chapter 7 and verse 17. Remember, he's talking here about the vision of the four beasts, Babylon, the Medes and Persians, the Greeks, and Rome. He says in verse 17, these great beasts, which are four in number, are four kings who will arise from the earth. But look over at verse 23. Then he said the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth. So really, Daniel here is equating kings and kingdoms. And so, what is my point? When we're talking about the king in verse 36, it's very possible that he has the kingdom of Rome in mind. Now, what questions do you have? I've been looking at this for a couple weeks, and you all haven't, so I don't want to go too fast. Yeah. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah, it's a great point. Tammy said Daniel's in the Old Testament, but Revelation's in the New, but it correlates so much, and it does. It really does.
But like something else I said is you don't think each book is by different people, and it could be multiple people, different time periods that you guys take into consideration where they all were located.
Right.
To who was writing what and how it all got fit together.
Right.
But I think it's interesting is how in the Old Testament, yet it's also in the New Testament.
Yeah, it's a good thought. Yeah. Other questions or comments? So what are we saying? Well, what am I saying? I don't know what you're saying. What am I saying? I think this king in verse 36 is Rome, and I think as you kick off these verses following 36, we're talking about things that the Romans did in the Roman Empire. Well, let's look at some more of the key things in verse 36. The king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Whoever this is, he's going to exalt and magnify himself above every god. Does that sound like the Roman emperors to you? From what we've learned about them? Oh yeah. They wanted to be worshipped as gods. And if you don't, you would be killed, potentially. What is the indignation? Indignation is just the outpouring of God's wrath. And I think you see that in the 70 AD event of the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. It's also interesting that he says here, I didn't highlight it, he will prosper until the indignation is finished. And so Rome is going to prosper, and God is going to use Rome to pour out his indignation on the Jewish nation. Now, that's interesting in and of itself, because does God use wicked nations to punish other nations? Would God use wicked nations to punish his own people? Babylon, Assyria, right? And even just not even talking about the people of God, God used the Babylonians and the Assyrians to punish other nations and to punish his own people. And so, yes, God does that. Throughout the Scripture, he does that. He uses wicked nations to punish even his own people. Look at verse 37 and 38. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desires of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. The Romans were power hungry. Power was their God. The God of fortresses was their God. And they were, as Daniel put it, exceedingly dreadful. They were very powerful. And they just trampled down like iron these other nations. And they would worship all of these other gods, or they would exalt themselves above all the other gods. They would do whatever it took to get power. And they worshiped warfare. Whatever it took to get this power over these nations, that's what they would do. Power hungry. Verse 39, he will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. What is this? He's going to have the help of a foreign god. Well, what do we know about the Romans and how they took over other nations? Rome made alliances with other nations. Rome made alliances with their armies and with their gods. And that's how they took over so much area. They made these alliances, and it says they would have great honor to those who acknowledge him. Rome made these client kings, these sub-kings that would rule over the people, and they would give honor, and they would basically leave these leaders alone if you collect your taxes and you keep revolts down. We don't want any trouble. Whoever would honor Rome and do whatever Rome said, they were pretty happy about that. They would honor those that would acknowledge them. Verse 40. At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. And he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. Anybody know their world history really well to maybe say what this is about? Yeah, you're good, Bob. Yeah, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra, who were Ptolemies, right? Well, at least Cleopatra was. Mark Antony was a Roman general who made an alliance with Cleopatra. They come against Rome, right? And I think that's what we're talking about here. They come against Rome, they collide with Rome. And what did Rome do? They weren't big fans of that, right, Bob? There's the Battle of Actium, which I really don't know a whole lot about. It's a giant battle where Mark Antony and Cleopatra from the south, they come against Rome, and there's just thousands of chariots and ships, and this is a giant war. And this is when Rome takes over Egypt and that whole area. And we're going to see that as we read on. He will also enter the beautiful land. What's that? What's the beautiful land? It's Judea, right? Jerusalem, the land of Daniel's people. Did the Romans do that? Yeah, remember when Jesus was born and when Jesus lived his life, he was a Jewish man, of course, but who was in control over that area? It's the Romans. So he will enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Somebody among us needs to look into that. The Edom, Moab, and sons of Ammon. You have to blow some dust off your history books, I think. But I bet if you went looking for this, you would see, the Romans. I did read a little snippet where the Romans did have trouble in these areas of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. But I don't know much about that. Somebody look into that for us. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. Did Rome take over Egypt? They did, and the Battle of Actium was a big part of that. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. Rome took over the Libyans and the Ethiopians. The history documents this. So you see, we're tracking right along with history. Things seem to be a pretty good fit, right? Verse 44 and 45. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and to annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. I'm not entirely sure what these are from the east and from the north. One suggestion are the Parthians and the Gauls, who gave Rome a lot of trouble. It's a possibility. And then we talk about pitching tents between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Rome had a lot of success in establishing their authority over Judea, over the Holy Land. So we're probably talking about the Mediterranean Sea and Jerusalem. They took over that area. And notice that he says at the end of 45, yet he will come to his end. So God is going to deal with Rome. Where do you read about that, by the way? You see that in the book of Revelation, right? Again, there's that connection that Tammy was mentioning. God's going to deal with Rome. You don't see that in this prophecy. But he's like, just know God is going to deal with them. They will come to their end. And God's going to take care of that. So, what questions or comments do you have? It's a lot to process, I know. Bob? Yeah. Yeah. That chapter in 2 Thessalonians, to me, is one of the most difficult in the Bible. And I thought about it as I was preparing the lessons. Is there a connection here between what Daniel is saying and what he's saying and what Paul is saying in 2 Thessalonians 2? And I don't know. But it's an interesting question that we could ponder. But I just don't know. Yeah, the man of lawlessness, who is that? Was that someone still to come? And in Paul's time, it seems to be. So you all can wrestle with that. Yeah, and you reminded me of in 1 John that we've been studying on Sunday mornings. He talks about many antichrists have gone out into the world. So it wasn't just one guy, but it was this spirit of antichrist, of the teaching that Christ didn't really come in the flesh and so on. This is antichrist. And so you have to have a little bit of caution about, are we talking about a man, the antichrist, or are we talking about there are many antichrists who have gone into the world, even at the time that John writes. So more stuff to ponder. Jim. Yeah, good question. That's right. That's the theme we've seen over and over again, isn't it? Right. The everlasting kingdom. It's coming. It's here from our perspective. For Daniel, it was still future. And that's the overarching theme and message. God is in control and still in control over the events of nations. And all of these details, of course, should encourage us that that's not just talk. God really does know exactly what's going to happen. And we can trust him and be confident that it's under his control. And I have still a lot of questions about end-time events and how everything's going to happen. But I know one thing, that God's going to take care of all of that. And thankfully, I don't have to understand it perfectly. However, I want us to try to deal with the material. It was funny, I was looking at there's a well-known commentator, and I thought, well, I'm gonna go over and see what he says about all of this. And he's got classes on Daniel online. I thought, great, I'll see what he's saying. And when he comes to this part of chapter 11, he says, this part of Daniel 11 is beyond the scope of the class. So, well, that's no help. So, I can see why he would go that route, because it's difficult, and you can get overwhelmed in the details, but it is important to keep that overarching message in mind.